We left off last week in Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 and 24. We were talking about the fact that obedience is a reflection of the heart. He makes the statement, we will always please the one we love the most. And then he adds to it and says, we will always reserve the best for the one we love the most. And he's going to he uses a practical illustration of children taking the biggest piece of pie. I read an article one time, I thought it was pretty good. Parents sat two boys down, they were fighting over a piece of pie, and they said, okay, you get to cut it. And the one boy cut it, got ready to take a piece, and he said, you get to pick the piece. And it was a valuable lesson because obviously one piece was quite a bit bigger than the other one because one boy had thought he had won out and had the opportunity to cut the piece and select it. And that's the practical illustration. Sometimes we reserve the biggest piece of pie or the best flavor or whatever it is for ourselves. Good biblical example. Turn to Malachi chapter 1. Malachi chapter 1, the same thing shows up, it just sounds a little differently here. But in verses 6 through 8, God is kind of taking him out to the woodshed because he's a little upset with the way that they are conducting their feasts and their sacrifices. And he says in verse 6, a son honoreth his father and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear? Now, stop there for just a second. He starts out with something that we recognize in society all the time. A son is supposed to honor his father, and a servant is supposed to honor his master. And when you see that those two things in practical living aren't working properly, you look at that whole situation and you say, I don't know, man, somebody needs to get a hold of that kid. He shouldn't be talking to his dad that way. And you would think that a master would have every right to be kind of harsh with a servant that is behaving that way. And God says, well, if I'm your father, then where's my honor? And if I am a master, how come you seem to have no fear of me? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name. Now, what's a priest supposed to do? Priests and pastors are supposed to be pointing people towards God. They're not supposed to be despising him. And you'll see the problem here and why he says this is such a big problem. And you say, wherein have we despised thy name? I don't even know what you're talking about, God. So he's just going to lay it out here in verse 7 and the start of verse 8. You offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that ye say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if ye offer the blind for a sacrifice, is it not evil? And if ye offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? This is a practical application where they are reserving the best for them. They are keeping the best for themselves, and they're giving all the sick ones to be offered. And the logic and the reasoning is quite simple. Well, listen, we're just going to kill this lamb. I might as well send the blind one up there because it doesn't make any difference. But God says if you did that to your governor, and that's where he starts his rebuke. If you took a blind lamb up to the governor and said, here you go, I have a gift for you, would you expect that the governor would be happy with you? Well, if you don't expect that the governor would be happy with you, then why do you think that it's okay that I'm happy with you? Jump down to verses 12 through 14. But ye have profaned in that ye say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even the meat, is contemptible. You said also, behold, what a weariness it is, and ye have snuffed at it. Now, you notice the attitude problem right away. They're bringing nasty bread because they didn't want to take the time to bake nice new bread. Oh, we baked last week. Why can't we just use the leftover stuff? It's growing a little mold. Well, it's not like anybody's going to eat it. All we're going to do is carry it into the temple and put it on the table of showbread, and it's just going to lay there and get dried out and moldy anyway. So what difference does it make? And we take that human logic and we say, well, we can just give this to God, or we can just throw this at God and he's going to be okay with it because it's not like he's doing anything with it anyway. But the attitude that shines out of that is, well, you have made it contemptible. In other words, what is supposed to be something that is part of our worship, they would carry the bread in there and lay it out on the table of showbread. That was supposed to be a serious part of their service as a priest, and that was supposed to be a part of their worship. And he's saying, you have made it contemptible. In other words, they didn't want to do it. And it's almost like, well, we need to get everybody together and go to church. And the kids are like, well, I don't want to go. Do I really have to? They look at it as contemptible. That's what we're talking about right here. That's the exact same situation. And the attitude comes out farther because they are bringing the lame and the sick. And they're saying, God says, should I accept this at your hand? I mean, you consider it a weariness, and you're kind of snuffing at the very idea that you have to make this sacrifice, and so you bring this wore-out thing instead of bringing something that brings honor to me. Verse 14, but cursed be the deceiver which hath in his flock a male, and voweth and sacrifices unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. And the last two phrases there of 14 identifies the whole problem in Malachi chapter 1. They do not see God as a great king, and they do not see him as dreadful among the heathen. They're tired of worshiping him. All the things about going to the temple have just become a drudgery and a weariness. Well, it's time to go for the morning sacrifice. Oh my goodness, do we have to? It would be better if we could do. And you go up there and the priests don't even want to be there. They don't want to carry the showbread in and lay it on the table. They're just going through the motions. And God says, really? The problem is you do not see me as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and you're not treating me that way. Obedience is a reflection of the heart, and when our view of God diminishes, then our obedience diminishes with it. He's going to go on and talk about the basic discipline of endurance. What is endurance? Well, endurance is the ability to keep doing something over and over and over and over again. An endurance runner doesn't run 1 mile and go, nailed it. An endurance runner finishes a marathon and then later in the day may even go and do some more training. Because it's the same over and over and over again. If you want to be shocked, look at the pace of most of the good marathon runners. Now, somebody asked me one time, have you ever run a 5-minute mile? Yes. Now ask me if I've run 3 of them in a row. And you think about the pace of a marathon, and most of the guys who are placing in the top of a marathon are running 5.5 to 6 minute miles the entire time. If you drop off to a pace of a 6-minute mile and you stay there for more than a mile or two, you do not stand a chance of placing in the top of a marathon. That's incredible. Most of us would struggle to run a 6-minute mile, let alone 21 of them. That's what endurance is. Endurance is when we don't quit after the 2nd mile or after the 3rd mile or after the 4th mile. Well, as it applies to this, what is biblical endurance? Endurance is continued obedience to God, even under pressure. Let me put it this way. What would it take to stop you? Turn to Hebrews 11 real quickly. We were studying this with the young men in Awana. And I want to we don't have the time, it's a great chapter, but we're just going to look at a couple of verses. I want you to look at verse 13. Hebrews 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises. Now that doesn't sound like somebody that should be in the hall of anything. They died and they didn't receive the promises. So why in the world are they included in the Hall of Fame? And he goes on and he says, but having seen them afar off and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. The reason you have Hebrews chapter 11 is because there was all kind of outside pressure trying to persuade these folks to do something other than what God wanted them to do, and they absolutely doggedly refused. That's what the verse says. Jump down to verses 24 through 26. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now there was a lot of stuff that went on, is associated with being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We know when he grows up in the palace, he has the best food, he has the best living conditions, he has a lot of money, and he has a lot of authority at his disposal. That is a title, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he gave all that up. And you think about a lot of the problems in the world today, and it's because folks are not willing to give up any of that for Jesus Christ. I'm not willing to give up food. I'm not willing to give up money. I'm not willing to give up a position or power. I'm not willing to give up anything. But there came a point in Moses' life when he looked out on his fellow servants and they realized, man, these guys are slaves. These are supposed to be my brothers and sisters in God. Am I going to live this way, or am I going to identify with Jesus Christ? And so you have 26 and 27, esteeming the reproach. Now notice, he doesn't say health, wealth, and prosperity gospel was more attractive than what Egypt had to offer. He says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, there's our word, as seeing him who is invisible. Did it cost Moses something? You better believe it did. But he did it anyway. And then you jump down to verse 32, and you have all of these folks, and you'd think that God would take the time to list everybody, but he can't list everybody. And so he closes this incredible chapter and says, and what shall I more say? For time would fail to tell me of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel and the prophets. Listen, he throws the prophets in there, and he doesn't even mention Elijah and Elisha, the guys responsible for most of the miracles in the Old Testament. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. That, right there, is endurance. And others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword, they wandered about. That's endurance. Hey, you break my leg, that's okay. I'll limp around and still preach Jesus Christ. They absolutely refuse to give up on Jesus Christ. Now, here's where Wednesday night and Sunday mornings are going to dovetail. And if we hadn't taken a break, we'd be there already, but that's okay. Memorial Day is important. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant. We're not going to read the rest of it, but what I do want you to look at is a phrase at the end of verse 8. It says, he became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Endurance is what he calls a cross-type obedience. You say, what in the world is a cross-type obedience? Let's put it in a little bit more modern KJV. All right? Non-KJV. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, and said, I'll die before I disobey. Now think about that. You fast forward to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is out there praying, and he is sweating great drops of blood, and he says, Father, if there be any way that this cup can pass from me, yet not my will, but thy will be done. And what's he saying? I know what is coming, and if this is what has to happen, I would rather die than disobey. I don't know about you, but I do some soul searching from time to time, and I sit there and look at that and think, I'm a long ways from that. I justify all the time, well, it wouldn't be bad, or, surely it's not talking about. And Jesus Christ said, I would rather die than disobey the Father. Would we rather die than disobey him? Relationship-based obedience. Absolute refusal to betray God by looking out for myself. I don't care how you cut the pie. I'm not even eating pie if you think that that is going to take me away somehow in my relationship from Jesus Christ. It's not going to happen. It's off the table. John chapter 4 and verse 34. I want to look at a couple of statements here real quickly. We'll stay in John for sake of time. But in John chapter 4 and verse 34, Jesus saith unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. Now here the disciples, they're arguing over, woman at the well, and they're bringing food back out, and they're like, here's your food. And he says, I have my food. In other words, what he was saying is, there will be time to eat your McDonald's hamburger in just a minute, but right now this lady is coming to salvation, and that's the most important thing. And over and over and over again, if we look at the life of Christ, we see him putting off food, and we see him putting off rest, and we see him putting off other things for the opportunity to minister, because it wasn't about his will. It was about his Father's will. Go to chapter 6 and verse 38. For I came down from heaven not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. Now, I don't want to get blasphemous or run off on a rabbit trail, but I just want you to think for a minute. If Jesus Christ left heaven and came down here on his own terms and lived his life on his own terms, how different would the Bible be? Because I'm pretty sure there aren't angels showing up to shepherds and saying, yo, why don't you head on down to the manger? No, I'm pretty sure the whole birth thing goes different if you're talking about the King of Glory just coming on his own for that purpose and not for the purpose of redeeming you and I. And so if you look at Jesus' life from the standpoint of what would it be like if he was just God and being selfish, and I understand that he's not. You see what I'm saying? Man, you would have a grand and glorious, I don't know if you'd have a birth, because that would be demeaning. And you would have the world's greatest showing up, and you would have, nobody would be allowed to question him, right? So you see an intense humility of himself, because his will is subjected to the Father's will. Chapter 8, verse 29. And he that sent me is with me. The Father hath not left me alone, for I do always those things that please him. Now, what kind of a testimony would we have if we ran around and folks thought, wow, that person always does the things that please God? I know that we are imperfect, and that's not going to happen. But what an incredible, incredible statement. Psalm 40, verse 7 and 8. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me, I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. Most people look at do's and don'ts and principles in Scripture, and they chafe against them because it's something that holds them back from living the way they want to. And the psalmist here is looking at it from a completely different perspective and says, I delight to do thy law. And we're going to close tonight in James chapter 1 and verse 12. James is a lot of practical application. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that, what's it say? Love him. Notice the link. Blessed is the man that endureth. We've been talking about endurance. They will obey no matter what. Why? Because it makes them look good? No. Because of the only reason they are enduring the temptation is because the Lord has promised to give them a crown of life to them that love him. Loving him and obeying him are linked. And when I obey and use that as a motivation for my obedience to Jesus Christ, then everything is different. It's no longer about do's and don'ts. It's no longer about this grocery list. It's no longer about any of that stuff. That's why in Hebrews chapter 11 you have all these folks who never realized the promise. Abraham wandered all over the promised land, and the only thing that he owned when he died was the field where the cave of Machpelah was, where he buried Sarah. And yet God promised him, standing on that mountain, look to the east, look to the west, look to the north, look to the south. Everything that your eye sees, I'm going to give to you. Did Abraham ever own it? No. Does that make God a liar? No. All the times where he was worried about whether or not God could take care of him, and so he lied about Sarah not being his wife but his half-sister, which was like a half-truth because she was but not really. And we do all that justifying, and God comes back to him, and when he corrects him, you know what he does? He reveals more of himself to him. And so by the time you get to Isaac and he asks Abraham, why don't you climb up that mountain and sacrifice Isaac? Listen, he's not looking to make excuses anymore. He's not looking to justify. It is obedience no matter what, because of the relationship. And you can start at the beginning when Abraham is asked to leave Ur of the Chaldees, and you can watch that relationship grow. And there are rocky times and there are troubled times. But by the time he gets to Isaac, there is no longer any question in his mind who exactly it is that he's dealing with. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, when God mentions Abraham, he says, well, he went to sacrifice Isaac thinking that God would raise him again from the dead. I don't know about you. That is an incredible, incredible thing to ask of God. It didn't seem incredible to Abraham at this point. So as we grow in our relationship with him, obedience ought not to be something that sounds like a curse word to us. It ought to be something that is near and dear to us. Praises or prayer requests tonight?